Chapter 7, Listening. And this is the start of what we're getting into with interpersonal. Typically, people really like this chapter. So my suggestion, even before we get into the video lecture, is do the self-test that's online. You'll find it in the weekly module notes. It's not going to take you more than about 5 or 7 minutes. It will give you a pretty good sense of the type of listener you are, and then I think you'll enjoy this part more. So yeah, pause and go take it. I'll wait. The first part of what I'm going to get into in this mini lecture actually is not from our textbook. I take it from another one. Most of ours has mini chapters in it, and most students really like the listening. I just like complementing it with other studies. So what other textbooks go into is that listening can often be more valuable than speaking. They were surveying managers in a position, and one of the things that managers talked about is the ability to listen effectively is one of the most important skills on the job. You know, and you could think about people who are great listeners. You could think about people who are poor listeners, and in the kinds of ways that they contrast each other. In problem-solving groups, the ones who are the better listeners often find that other people are judging them as having the best leadership skills. You know, and obviously people need to talk too, not just quietly listening on the side, putting things into action, but really good listeners often have a great balance of that listening and following. If you think about people you know who tend to dominate a conversation, you know, maybe think about why they might be poor listeners or what makes them. You know, maybe they're not heard in other contexts. It might be that they don't even realize what poor listeners they actually are, especially when they talk louder just to be heard. What's interesting that goes back to the study of the managers and executives is that when other people were rating those skills, so for instance, the executives were asked how they listen, what's important in the people that they work with, and then the people they work with were asked to respond about the manager. And a lot of times what they found was those managers were not quite as good as they perceived. So a lot of times it's the bias in what we think we might be like. You know, if you think about it in terms of family, if you think about it in terms of friends, again, what makes someone a really good listener? I'm guessing that many of you are really good listeners. You're probably the ones that friends come to. It might be you're really good at customer service, that you are the manager, or it might be when there are problems at work that people come to you for it. Examples that people have said in class before when they realized their manager was not a good listener. This was a big one around proms, again, pre-quarantine, when people asked for days off, maybe around the prom, graduation. The manager said, yep, sure, and then all of a sudden they were on the schedule. And they really were trying to listen according to the students who said it, and then just in one ear and out the other. So what this chapter goes into is concentrating on different styles of listening, different types of listening, and then ways to get better once you pay attention to that. So in our textbook, it goes through a 5-step listening process that a student once was trying to remember for a test, and he called it RIRA, which we'll go through each of one of these. In other textbooks, they use another model. It's 6 steps, and it's called HURIER. That goes from hearing and understanding and a few others. Many are very similar. We'll concentrate on the one in our textbook with our 5-step process. So the very first part is receiving. So think about it. If it ever happens when people are noisy around you, if you're trying to concentrate on whether it's a TV show, whether you're talking on the phone, whatever it might be, and things get in the way. It could be something like we just said in terms of physiological. The physiological are the noises that get in the way, and it could be something that's psychological. So for instance, if you had a pretty bad day and you have other things on your mind, it might be really, really hard to just take in someone's message. When we go back and talk about salience, that's the word importance, and perceptual filters are own biases. In terms of interpreting, when the textbook goes into the informational, the contextual, and relational cues, again, it might be the same way that two people take in a message completely differently. For some of you, you might absolutely love Com 101. You can't wait to take another class. For other people, it might be you don't want to take another class like this ever again. It's the same message that people are getting, especially in a video lecture, but it might just be the way two people interpret it. For one person, it's the best ever. For somebody else, never again. You're going to like the next part on recalling. So what studies show is we forget 50% of what we just heard. So if people ever told you that you have a selective memory, you can come back to this video lecture and point it out in the textbook why that's so. Recall after 8 hours is only 35%, and then after a whole day, we only remember 20%. So it doesn't mean that we're not listening. There's only a certain amount that we can actually store in our brains to recall. When we talk about evaluating, we do it in terms of credibility, completeness. It definitely builds our critical thinking skills. So think about it when in a couple weeks we are looking for sources, right? And you're vetting for the most credible. You might have some friends as they tell you stories and they're tall tale tellers and you're like, this doesn't really add up. And then for other people, you know that they never ever stray anywhere from the truth. So in terms of evaluating, we do that in lots of different ways with lots of different people. And then the last one that we do in terms of responding is the verbal and nonverbal ways that we give messages. So whether we do it with our friends and family face to face, whether we do it in discussion board, whether we do our speeches live in Zoom, we're always giving feedback in different ways. So the next part that we're going to move into, and you're going to get to see a wonderful clip if you're interested in the end of Everybody Loves Raymond, one of my favorite shows, is paraphrasing. And this is the part that comes in with responding. So especially when people are upset, rather than just giving advice or rather than just nodding our head, both can be good things in different parts. What we're going to be concentrating on at the end of this chapter is the idea of paraphrasing. And you've heard that before when you put words into your own. What I heard you saying was, or it sounds like you're really upset because, and that goes into the responding. And you'll see more of that at the end. Some interesting research that I pulled from the chapter that I think that you'll like is that people who build their listening skills tend to do better at school. So in terms of academic success, whether it's listening to lectures, whether it's face-to-face, whether it's online, but when we get to be better listeners, we're usually more critical in what we remember. When you click on this link, this actually comes from NatCom. So that is the NCA's National Communication Association. It's one of the places where I often present at conferences. And for people who are communication majors, and we've got a few in the class, you might be really interested in this website and also the posting on Chronicle of Higher Education. And one of the things that it talks about online here is all the skills that communication graduates have and they could put on their resume. Now, the truth is other people absolutely could put it on, whether it's those critical listening skills, whether it's empathy. But when you click on this link, it actually talks about all the ones that we develop across the major. The last one students often really like too, in terms of listening for relationships, you can see the heart and the brain. A lot of times there's these gender differences of what we do. So for women, we often want that connection. Guys, it usually comes the first thing of wanting to give advice when people just want to help. But a lot of times it's just hearing someone out, which makes it really validating. And you'll get to hear of the different styles as we continue. So one of the things that you're going to see in the contrast of these two slides is there's listening types and listening styles. What I asked you to take in the beginning a few minutes ago, the self-survey test, that comes up on the next slide. That is a listening style. It's your preference. And you might look to developing the other kinds. These are different types that we use in different contexts, and we typically will use them all at different times. So, for instance, the very first one on discriminative. What the textbook goes into is if you go outside to walk your dog and you hear a noise out on the lawn, you're probably going to be really careful where you take your dog to walk so that it's safe in case there's, a raccoon in your backyard or something else down the street. So physiological is more about the noise part of it. When we do informational listening, the textbook concentrates on the difference a lot between school versus work. So for instance, in school, a lot of times teachers will give handouts, professors will review again. You can always do things through email. I have a part up on the discussion board to clarify. You could always come for Zoom office hours or make an appointment. So in terms of informational, a lot of times when we're in college, we can get it in many different ways. You probably already know on the job aspect of it that your supervisor might say things once, you may not even take notes, and he or she just expects that you understand what's going on. So there's a huge difference just in the way that information is given out in school versus work. In terms of critical, I want to be really clear that it's not the negative connotation of when we criticize. When we're critical, we analyze and evaluate. So you might think about it in which is the best beach to go to, especially in these socially distant ways. So it might be that you're looking at different newscasts, you are reading the paper, looking for different information, you're hearing things from your friends, and then that's when you decide, taking information in from all different kinds of cues. The last one is empathic, and that's what one is more concentrated on people. So it's other oriented in terms of what another person is feeling. We're thinking about it more from another person's perspective. So what you see in the clip art are the different feelings. And if you could see this one over here, can you tell the kinds of shoes? You're correct if you're thinking moccasins. And you probably heard that phrase before about holding judgment, right? Trying walking through someone else's shoes and moccasins. So those are the 4 different types. What students usually like is the next slide, where we move into our favorite styles and then trying to develop some strengths in the other areas where we may not pay much attention to. So interestingly, I would think that a lot of you are people-oriented listeners. Even though the textbook claims that that is the most challenging one, I find a lot of times in a face-to-face class, that's actually the most popular one, because people are just good-hearted and good-natured, and they're listening to other people's stories, and they like that. So what each of these columns give are the positive and then the negative. So in terms of people-oriented, you might prefer to have that style and it comes really easy to you. You might like it when your best friends or family members or a coworker might have that style too, because they're really interested in people's feelings. And that makes us feel heard, and that's something wonderful. One of the negatives to that is somebody might get really distracted concentrating so much on people's feelings. So for instance, if there's a task to get done at work and everybody needs to pitch in, but you notice an expression on someone's face that they're really upset. So then you want to talk to that person, which again is a fantastic way in terms of making the person feel heard, but a distracting part if a job needs to get done. It's not at all that these styles are better and worse. Like I keep saying, everything has its positive and negative. The next one is a target, about the action-oriented. So these people are very good at knowing what needs to get accomplished and very often gathering information to do it in a really effective way. One of the negatives to this style is someone who's a very action-oriented listener will often lose patience for someone who's not telling a story in a very direct and relevant way. So this is supposed to be the long and maybe winding road. The next one is the content-oriented listener. So if people came out this way, you might really enjoy very complex information, seeing all different avenues, and really getting to dissect either in reading or what people have to say. That's a wonderful thing. One of the negatives might be is that it's really time consuming, and sometimes people might even run out of time. And the last one is the time oriented listener. Now, what's interesting about this, I would think that the people in the textbook are not these listeners and they don't prefer it because they don't write about it in a very positive light. So I'd like to give you the other slant of it in case any of you came out this way, because it's not necessarily a bad thing, although the textbook would make you believe that it is. Someone who's a time-oriented listener is very efficient in what they do, and they want to get from point A to B and do it as quickly as possible without any sidetracking. So for people who are very busy, they can also do this in a way that doesn't make people feel frustrated, because they can still be kind, but still really hone in on what needs to get done. The reason why it's negative is because sometimes some people might cut people off. And obviously that doesn't make people feel really good. So those are the 4 different styles. Look where your strength is and try to develop some of the other ones over the course of your life too. Feel free to send that test out to friends as well. So as I promised from a few slides ago, what I wanted to go back to is what I think is the most important takeaway of the listening chapter in terms of the responding. Another phrase for paraphrasing is also active listening. So what we're doing here is just in terms of that empathic listening to what someone says and then putting it in your own words. You might use this a lot at work in terms of customer service when someone has a complaint. So if you're working in the food industry and somebody calls you over, so what you're saying is, this came out really cold. Okay, let me see what I can do. This actually can work really good in relationships. When somebody tells you what's bothering them, rather than giving a reason of why you did what you did, it might be, so I hear you saying, I made you really upset when I didn't clear the dishes out of the sink today, and then when you went to cook, you had a mess to clean up. So again, it's not giving advice, it's not getting defensive, it's just hearing what someone else said and then validating it. The reason why it's so effective is because when people are really frustrated, they often don't feel heard. I work with a lot of students in criminal justice, and we role play this a lot when we're face to face. Because especially when people are going on calls that might be extremely emotional, sometimes just taking a step back and having the person feel validated, even if you don't agree with what they're saying, could be really helpful. Now, I warn you, if you go and try this on a sibling, if you try this on a romantic partner and it's totally out of the blue from what you normally do, they're going to call you on it. But a lot of times where this is really helpful is starting from scratch with people that you don't know, because they don't know another way that you typically respond. If you are looking to do this in relationships, feel free to say that you're testing out something new, because chances are you're going to have a very different response than you typically do, and from the other person. I'll be very honest that it feels awkward at first, but that's because usually we tend to get defensive, and again, we tend to say why we do things. When someone just feels heard, it can really change the dynamic in some pretty interesting ways. So again, if a friend is pretty upset with you and they say, you didn't get back to me all day, all right, so you're saying you're frustrated because you waited for a text and I didn't do it. So you can even ask a question. How long do you figure is too long? Because again, for some people, they might get upset if they don't hear back within 10 minutes. For another person, it might be a few hours. So being able to figure these things out with the people who are important to you is why this makes a difference. So what you're going to see on the last slide, if you're interested, is from Everybody Loves Raymond's. I'm just showing you a couple of clips here, but if you want to check it out on YouTube, there is a whole episode called Father Knows Least. And these together are probably about 8 or 10 minutes. You could watch the whole clip of 22 minutes, no commercials, where they actually do a whole parenting class on active listening. So I hope you like this part. And for the most part, you're probably going to find it really useful in life. I'll see you for the next chapter.